presentations this afternoon, and our first is going to start to build off of everything we've been doing all weekend. And the two that you're going to hear most from in our first hour together are Kate Haynes and Cecilia Tan. Kate is the IWBC Archivist and digital content producer. In her real job, she is the Information Resources Supervisor at the University of Michigan Libraries. That's her day job every single day. The rest of it fills the rest of her hours. Grad student at both the University of Michigan and Marshall University.
Uh-oh.
Last year. And if you didn't figure it out over the last 2 days, are one of our resident Blue Jays fans. So I had to throw that in there for you, Kate. Because that's going to contrast, of course, with Cecilia Tan, who is the SABR Publications Director and has been since 2011, writer and editor. And this will tell you her baseball affiliation, if you didn't already know it. And one of her books is the 50 Greatest Yankee Games. And so Cecilia is a Yankee fan. Also founded a blog in 2000, Why I Like Baseball, edits the baseball herself from 2007, primarily, if you're not familiar with them, with the Pawtucket Slaterettes. But today what we're going to be talking about is opportunities for research, writing, publication, and creating archives. As we've heard from many of our speakers over the course of this weekend, the necessity to not only tell stories, but to preserve those stories, to document them. You heard Jay Hurd talking about the issue of documentation, right? When he was talking about Lizzie Murphy and all the myths that exist and the need to find the documentation to back these up, or to be able to say, no, it's not there, we don't have it, right? That's a really good example of the kind of thing we're talking about. And so we're going to get this opportunity. And I would encourage you, as you have questions, to please, if you have them as we're going along, to put them in the chat. I have plenty of opportunity to engage with all of you, because this is one of those topics that's the goal, is to hear from all of you as well. So I want to start with Kate. And Kate, as an archivist, that is your background. Before we get into how we and why these are necessary, you're interested particularly in the idea of community archives. And for those who don't necessarily know means in comparison, could you explain a little bit about community archive and why they're important and how they differ from other kinds of archives?
Oh, of course. So community archives is really this true notion that the community itself should be responsible for creating and preserving their own memory. Community is defined in a plethora of ways, but largely boils down to any self-identifying group in any way they deem necessary. So it can be as broad as women or as specific as international women's baseball. And the idea is that, true to their own memory, that the archive is created through the community creators. So while I am a trained archivist and librarian and have expertise in the subject, I might not necessarily fit into different aspects of the community. And so it might not make me the best person to create and cultivate these collections. What it does do, though, is it gives you a trained archivist, and the community can come to me and go, hey, I've got these things, we'd like them to be preserved, we'd like our public memory to be put out there, and we want this organization to do it. So I feel that the IWBC Board of Directors has been very supportive in this idea of, if there is a group or a collection that wants to be cultivated, the community can come to me and work with me to create collections and get that memory out. We see it in a myriad of ways that really pushes back on this idea of the dominant culture. So it pushes back on the idea of, clearly women have been involved in the game forever, but our memory isn't there. And so community archives can work to push against that and give and cultivate collections and exhibits and resources to provide that from the community members themselves.
And so in this particular case,
Mhm.
from your view, particularly with the international aspect of some of this, this would allow those communities essentially to work with you to establish their stories.
Yes, that is exactly what that's about. I, in the grand scheme of things, am very new to the women's baseball community, especially the international aspect. So while I have my own expertise in certain aspects of history, I further reach out to the women that have lived and played and participated in all aspects of the international game to really learn that, and to provide those resources, whether it's, you know, sharing something out on our social media or inviting them to be podcast guests in our digital content production.
And so that would indicate to people, and we're going to get to some of the specifics of the archives here in a little bit, but that would indicate that the archives can take on a variety of different forms, and they're not just the typical sort of paper archives that so many of us think of, because you just mentioned digital.
Yes. So archives are as pervasive as all types of content are to us, whether, you know, they're newspaper article snippings of the 1890s to, you know, archived Instagram live interviews, you know, that Baseball for All might put on or something like that. So any type of consumable creation that you can think of can be an archive. There's archives of zines, there's archives of photographs, there's archives of literally nothing that has ever existed in physical form and just exists digitally.
And we're going to get to some of those here momentarily, because I know that that's going to be one of the things that people are interested in. But I wanted to turn to Cecilia for a moment, because as we think about all of these aspects of how we do research things, we also want to be able to tell those stories. And so in your role, certainly as the publications director for SABR, there are lots of opportunities, both regular, and then I know that there's a new opportunity coming up with SABR. So you want to talk a little bit about some of the kinds of things and opportunities that are available to people?
For sure. So yeah, I have made myself a list of sort of what are the SABR publications program has expanded a lot over the years. And then in the past 10 years, when I've been PD in particular, we've had a lot of different opportunities, both in digital and in print. So I'm just going to kind of run down them. The entry point for a lot of people, and one that I think is where I want to really push specifically for women in baseball, is the Bio Project. The Bio Project is a never-ending project of SABR to write biographies of every person ever involved in baseball at all. And that includes all the players, all the front office people, everyone in minor league baseball, you know, literally hundreds of thousands of people over the history of the game. And of course, obviously that will probably never be done, but that's what makes it fun and interesting. So the bios are published on the SABR website, and then sometimes also in books. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but there are very specific subject parameters and information that have to be in every bio for a bio to be a SABR bio. And there's a team of editors who work with each writer. And a lot of times when people join SABR, the Bio Project is one of the first places where they end up getting involved. And a lot of the time it'll be, oh, there was this one major league ball player in my hometown, you know, who played in whatever, or my grandfather played in a textile mill league in South Carolina, and we have his jersey. We want to know more about him. That person ends up going on a whole, you know, journey, becomes a baseball researcher in the process. And then the next thing they know, they're like, well, who else can I write about? What else can I research? And, you know, off you go. Among some of the women that I would love to see bios written of, and that I don't think we have bios of yet, are people like Judy Scarafiel, who was the longtime president of the Cape Cod League, who has she just recently retired. And so a couple little articles came out about her that make it sound like she had a very, very interesting life story. got thrown out of the press box at Yankee Stadium once, I think. And yeah, some stuff like that. So it's just like, okay, somebody's got to talk to her. And
Clearly living the dream.
yeah. Well, and then the thing that's interesting is then because there was a woman in charge of the Cape Cod League for so long, some of the Cape Cod League teams have had women general managers. They've had, like there's been, because once a door opens, people feel more comfortable and, to buck the norms, right? So I'd also love for somebody to write us a bio of Ann Ochi, who was the main designer in the baseball commissioner's office from 1990 until just recently retired. I mean, she was basically the de facto brand image manager for all of MLB for decades. But it took a while for them to actually give her the vice president of marketing title, and which they finally did, at least, but yeah, recently retired. And, her name is never going to be known to the average fan out there, but talk about someone who literally shaped our perception of the game for some people's whole lifetimes. It's like someone should be writing her story. So the bio project is one. The bio project has a sister project called the Games Project, which is all sort of game recaps. They also live on the SABR website that are 1,500 words or less for the most part. They have a specific format, and they tend to be major league games because they're typically games for which we can verify the game action in some way. So it's a little harder to write up some of the Negro League games, for example, if we don't have coverage of them. But we're working on it, So, and if that's the white whale you want to hunt down, yeah, go for it, right? To see if you can find someone who's got a scorebook and a scrapbook somewhere, or whatever it is, right? So then comes committee projects and books, which are sometimes driven by the bio project. So we have books like I've got one here that is Puerto Rico and baseball, and it's 60 biographies of significant Puerto Rican players who appeared in the major leagues. Some of them are team driven, like this one is Harvey's Wallbangers, the 1982 Milwaukee Brewers, and it's a bio of every player, coach, manager, front office, general manager, a couple of other, and sometimes, and the broadcasters usually also, all collected in one book. And then often, if this is, was a championship or pennant winning year, or whatever, there'll also be games project recaps of the significant games from that team and some other stuff. So then it becomes sort of like a yearbook almost for that team. So those are kind of bio project driven. And then there are ones that are just committee driven, like the Business of Baseball Committee started a book series on the winter meetings, and it had to be 3 volumes because there have been a lot of winter meetings in the history of Major League Baseball. And there's one for, so 1 chapter per year. And these are team projects in that they're a group effort. One person is not trying to write all 150 years of winter meetings. It was, different people signed up to do different years, different teams, different, et cetera. So that's how we get them done as quickly as we do, because if a single researcher tried to write every bio of, 80 different guys who, whatever, it would, be a long process. Whereas if you've got 50 researchers and they're each doing 2, doesn't take quite as long. So, and then everybody gets to kind of, get their hands under the hood, and that's part of what we wanted to do with some of the book projects, was sort of stimulate people to research more. And so some of these players who are lesser known, well, if you're doing the entire roster of a team, then, it's like you're going to get the all-stars and also the guys who were only there for 2 weeks at the end of September and then, 2 years later became an accountant, and those people are interesting too. So, it was like, yeah. I'll note that we have a SABR editorial board now too. So when people want to bring a project like this to us, they have to propose it. And then the editorial board meets twice a year to approve projects for the next sort of 18 months out typically. I'll note that we take projects all year round and then we just decide on them twice a year. So if you have an idea, go ahead and ask, and we can give you the tips on how to put a project together and how to pitch it. And then there's an online form that you fill out. Then we've got the journals. So the Baseball Research Journal is SABR's oldest publication. It's an interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journal. published twice a year, and it is always open to women in baseball topics because it's always open to all baseball related topics. So, of course, we get a lot of history and statistical analysis, but we also get sociology, architecture, biomechanics, game theory, urban planning, pop culture. If somebody can relate it to baseball and they can present it in a thoroughly researched, fairly academic way, we use the Chicago Manual style, we're open to it. In fact, we're going to have an article coming up in the fall issue on a game called Lang Ball, which might be the precursor of kickball. And it was invented by a guy who was, et cetera. It's interesting, like sort of 19th century story with illustrations out of like a children's game book about how with Lang Ball, you had to hang from the bars, basically in like on a playground, and you kicked the ball by swinging yourself. And then, and then the fielders were arranged like they are on baseball, and, and it's really fantastic, interesting, so it's like,
Wow.
and the researcher was like, I don't really know where to publish this. I'm like, this is completely relevant to baseball as far as I'm concerned, send it to me. So, maybe it's a little bit of a side trip, but I figure people who are interested in the history of baseball will be interested in this. So, I felt it was, and then it passed peer review, so it'll be in the journal. And then there's the National Pastime. The National Pastime is an annual journal typically themed to the region where the Summer SABR convention is located, which, moves all around. But of course, during the pandemic, we did a Baltimore themed journal in 2020, and then we didn't have the convention. And then last year, we again didn't have or this year, 2021, we again didn't have the convention, but we were like, all right, we have to theme it to something other than Baltimore since we just did a Baltimore, and so we did the future of baseball, which was a very interesting experiment and a lot more editing than I usually have to do, because trying to make historians write about the future turned out to be really difficult. But they came out fantastic, but it was a lot of work. Every piece had to go through several iterations. And we have not yet announced what the 2022 theme is going to be. We haven't quite decided yet. We're mulling it over, and the powers that be are mulling it over. Typically, we announce that theme right after the World Series ends every year, the Major League World Series. And then that gives people a couple of months to, people have about a month to pitch ideas. We talk about it, make sure that we don't have two articles that are too similar, et cetera. And then everybody has, gets spring deadlines to turn in their first drafts. So we don't know yet what the next theme is going to be. I will tell you that the spring baseball research journal is going to have a theme, at least a themed section, but potentially the entire journal will be essentially how do I put it? I don't want to say celebrate, because that sounds wrong. We are marking the anniversary of Title IX by essentially asking for specifically research on women in baseball. They don't have to, the articles don't have to have anything to do with Title IX itself. I felt that was too narrow. And the thing that I think a lot of people forget is that Title IX was not specifically about athletics. It just has had such a visible effect in the public eye to, the fact that colleges have had to equalize their opportunities for women's athletics. That is the thing that really sticks in the mind of people, and that has made just, a drastic difference. So, so I've already filled about 3/4 of that journal, because people jumped on that idea right away. And in specific, I wanted, if ever there was going to be a SABR publication that had more women than men in it, I thought this would probably be it. But the guys are very, on top of things too. So get on the stick. If you have something that you'd like to research, including a bioproject bio of Ann Ochi, please let me know. So the way to start the process of publishing the journal is first just send me an email with what your story idea is, and then we'll talk about it. And I'm ctan@sabr.org, so I'm pretty easy to find. There are, of course, other places to publish research out there. There are places like the 9 journal. There's the Journal of Women's History, which I have seen occasional sports related topics pop up in. And then there are, of course, online places like Baseball Prospectus and Fangraphs, which are mostly focused on contemporary issues, which sometimes go off in other directions if they have somebody smart and interesting writing something smart and interesting. So there are opportunities out there, but that's sort of the rundown of what we got at SABR. So
Appreciate that, Cecilia. And I just put your email in the chat for everybody, but the particular publication coming up, if you've got something right now that you're thinking about, Cecilia, as she pointed out, there's still opportunities to get something into so lots and lots of places to publish. And so so we have lots of places. Sometimes it just takes us thinking about where to pitch it, or you hear something. And quite frankly, a lot of publications just haven't thought about it and are likely to say yes if you pitch a good idea. And so that brings me back to Kate. And Kate, so we recognize all of these potential opportunities that Cecilia just so nicely laid out for us. And one of the things people want to know is, well, what kinds of databases are out there? How do we find these things? And so certainly you've been working on building up those for the IWBC, and I know people would like to hear about some of those, both what we have, and then from your perspective, what would be so Cecilia told us a couple of the bios that she'd like to see happen. What would you like to see that isn't out there?
So we do have some stuff. Actually, in July, we posted this blog that I just dropped into the chat, and it will link to most of the things I'm going to talk about here in a minute. But we have, in the last 5 years, begun to create a online archive. We didn't have physical space until recently. Even with the physical space, there's not a great centralization to keep a lot of physical items. And in terms of accessibility and the fact that we are an international organization, having an online archive is really important. That being said, we also are an extremely new organization, and most of our money goes towards trying to build a physical space for us. So we also have to take into consideration, we don't have money to put into creating these databases and whatnot. So when I started working archives wise for the IWBC, I was still a student. I had just kind of become interested in archives. And I had a collection that we were trying to digitize. And we decided just to do that. All we did was digitize it, organize it a little bit, and it literally sat on a flash drive for 3 years, I'm pretty sure. So no one had access to it other than me. In 2020, I partnered with the IWBC again in a more official capacity for an internship as a digital archivist through my time at the University of Michigan. And we have created a digital online through Google Drive. So anybody that has access to the links should be able to access everything in it. Keeping in mind some copyright issues, sometimes you just get an items list, and then if you have access to that database, you can get into it. And those types of things are things that once we have a more physical space and a better revenue stream, we would be able to provide access to those databases. One of them being newspapers.com. I can't just give you guys those articles. I don't want the IWBC to get sued for that.
I will mention that SABR members now get access to newspapers.com through sabr.org. So if you're a SABR member, you can now, you can get that free from home.
Yes. And so if you were to be a SABR member and to use the links in our item lists for the Haynes Collection, which is our first fully digitized collection, it's from my research in grad school for my history degree. So if you were to click on those links and be accessed through SABR, you would actually be able to see all of those clippings that I did. And there's over 2,000 articles from 1942 to 1955, all having to do with the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So we have those. We've just got a couple of collections fully digitized. Archival processing takes time, and as Leslie mentioned, I have a day job. So you know, there's lots of things on my to-do list, and I work on them when I get a chance. One of the things that we have been capable of creating that's a little bit more interactive are our resource pages. These link to active girls teams and leagues, inactive girls teams and leagues, organizations, collections, exhibits. We have a resource page on last year's conference. We'll have one on this year's conference as well. And some of these actually do link to international aspects. I will tell you, unfortunately, we are much more US and Canadian centric than I would like, but I'm always interested in hearing more. We actually have a form. I'll drop it. It's in the blog post, but if you come across information on those pages, or just interested in questions and whatnot, you can fill that out. You know, our resource pages require keeping the links up to date. You know, pages go bad, organizations get better funding and get better pages. So some of those links might not be good anymore. And I can't check those all the time. So if you notice that, or, you know, you're like, this is actually the wrong link, this is them now, or they're not active anymore, or actually I know about this team, you can fill out that form as many times as you want, and we'll do our best to get things updated.
So Kate, one of the questions that just came in that's pertinent to what you're talking about, Ryan had asked not only what kind of things are in the community archives, which you're talking about, but how are these useful to researchers who might potentially be even outside these communities when communities are creating them themselves?
It's putting our voice behind the narrative. So one of my big community archives that I continuously think of when I'm trying to push that is Ferguson, Michigan. Ferguson's community didn't control the narrative in what most people know about the issues in Ferguson. And so the community and the people involved and the activists and whatnot came together and they said, you know what? We should be able to control this narrative. And there is actually a digital archive online. I cannot remember the link to it right now, that fully digitizes all of the occurrences. It's still being added to because the issues in Ferguson have not been fully addressed, to put weight behind that narrative, and to push back and say, you know, this is what we've been told through mainstream media and what people believe is going on, but this is actually our perspective and our articles and our stories. And so that's where it comes in. It gives the perspective from the voices of the community at large.
So I also just want to point out to people, if you're paying attention to the chat, there's a lot of links being put in there. Bill Nowlin just put one in there. Thank you, Bill, to a lot of the, as he pointed out, dozens of resources beyond just newspapers.com available to members through the SABR.org website. Just pointing out that if you've got an idea, and there are a lot more resources, and sometimes you just simply have to be, you just have to do a little searching, or you just have to reach out to people. And one of the things that's important, particularly for all of us, is the sense of community that people will, and Cecilia pointed that out, right? Reach out and you're going to get help. If you've got an idea, there's lots of these kinds of pieces out there for everybody. And so that's all you have to do, is be sure to reach out. If you have other questions, please don't hesitate to throw them in the chat. I'm seeing lots of comments so far. I did see that Elizabeth Oster asked if SABR has a database of women in baseball. That is something certainly that we are constantly working on and playing with. And I probably have one of the more extensive lists of that is we're going to make available here pretty soon through the SABR Women in Baseball Committee, because I wrote the first edition of the Women's Baseball Encyclopedia, and I'm currently working on a much needed updated version because it came out now a significant number of years ago. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to include, thanks Cecilia, as many as we
Like, I think I've got it right here.
as we possibly can in that. And then Laureen just put in a plug for her podcast about the Ferguson Library. So thank you, Laureen. And speaking of Laureen, we're also going to, she's been something we didn't do last year, but thinking about this question, she's putting together a bibliography of all the books and things mentioned by our various speakers over the course of the weekend that we'll be sending out to everybody so that you have all of those particular links and things. Kate, from the standpoint, yes, of what we have, what would you like to see being developed? Sort of your wish list, like Cecilia had a couple of examples of people that she would like to see.
Well, I think one of the great steps that we took in the last year, and unfortunately we've had to take a bit of a step back from it just because we do function on a volunteer basis, is the digital content and giving voice to those stories in a more pointed way. We kind of worked in the first 6 months of the podcast to mark the Negro League celebrations, which was kind of the focus of the IWBC in 2020. And we had attempted to kind of mark International Women being the focus for our 2021. Of course, that becomes a little bit more difficult when you're dealing with time zones and whatnot, but we did have a great conversation with some Latin American organizers earlier in the year. We've sat down with Luis Lopez at the end of last year, and I can officially tell you now that in 1 month we'll be launching our next episode, which is a sit down with Amy McCann, who also has her own podcast. So she's a former Australian player, and she has been interviewing people for women's baseball, the Inside Pitch. I think they're on 9 episodes now, and she's covered 4 continents and 5 countries, and hopes to really reach out to more and put voice to those international perspectives and show that, you know, we are there. So continuing that and continuing to focus that and expand it the best that we can to truly show all of the aspects that women exist in the game. We have talked to documentary filmmakers, we've talked to organizers, we've talked to players, we've talked to actors, you know, so to continue those conversations, even though we have had to take a step back. When we did do that step back, it was around Women in Baseball Week, and we launched a new initiative called the Meet Our Community Initiative. And that is something that I would love to see take off. We've only had a few people actually participate. A link to our playlist there of YouTube episodes, but it is very much the idea of community archives. They're 3 to 6 minutes of telling people who you are, how you're involved, and who, like, just talking about the game itself, to show that anybody can be a part of the community as long as they know what women's baseball is, for the most part, in partnership with you.
Yeah, so Kate just put that in, and this is something to encourage, you know, all of us to think about as a way to begin to collect those stories, because we tend to think about this idea as something, you know, that we've got to now go research the past, right? And remembering that we also need to document what's happening now in the, if we haven't learned anything from, right, is that we need to document the now as well, and not just simply look to researching the past. And so yes, this and this is me as a historian saying that, so it's kind of, but particularly in women's baseball, more so even than any, if we haven't, because of the difficulties of recapturing those stories later on. And it's not as big a deal, but historically, right, women got married, they changed their names, all kinds of things happened, made it very difficult to, and so if we haven't learned anything, we need, and so good example of what Kate is talking about there is that particular idea. And so I know Kate would love to hear from people.
Yeah,
on that
and
one.
if you guys are interested in that, I did drop the instructions on what to do if you want to do that. I am very much willing to work with anybody on the tech side of it as well. And then it gets posted on our Facebook, our Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. So it kind of hopefully helps to generate
Mhm.
more interest.
Cool. Very cool.
So Cecilia,
Yeah.
thinking about all of these aspects, and we're talking about resources and ways to collect all this information, and you just talked about all the wonderful places to publish. Since you are the publications director, right, you have been, and you are that, what
Yeah.
advice might you give to people who might be amongst this group who maybe have not done much of this yet, haven't really, and think, oh, I don't know even how to get started. I'm not a writer. I'm not any of these things. What advice might you have?
Well, one of the great things about SABR is that it's not just academics, it's not just professional writers, it's not just, people who have the word historian on a plaque on their door. It's just enthusiasts, people who love baseball, people who kind of get sucked in for whatever reason. Maybe they've always loved the game and now they find they have just a little more time on their hands and they end up, I'll tell you, the pandemic has led to an explosion in baseball research because a lot of people were like, well, I'm stuck at home and last year there were no games for most of the time. What can you do? Well, people went down their research rabbit holes and, yeah, my queue is immense right now as a result, and it's great. It's great, but yeah, you can it's sort of a community where people who are like, I'm new, I don't know what to do. You can basically find mentorship. You can find people who are interested, first of all, in the specific topic that you're interested in, probably, no matter how obscure it is. Or there'll be somebody who has a parallel, research, we've got a researcher who's working on researching essentially military-based teams from the late 1800s, in Western expansion that, every outpost and fort had a team, and then they would sometimes travel on horseback to other forts to play other teams and, things like that, because of course they didn't have a lot to do, I guess. And then, there would be these reports that are and then 2 of them were killed on the way back trying to ford the river. And, you're just like, oh my God, and those stories would be completely lost, if somebody weren't digging them up, right? That kind of a thing. And it's like, okay. So yeah, it's like whether you jump in through something like the Games Project or the Bio Project, or you're like, hey, I have this thing I want to research. How do I get to it? Find the SABR committee that is the closest to its topic. SABR has 3 dozen committees now. And then there's even, I put a little mention in the chat also that, for example, we've got a literary journal now called Turnstile, where you can publish also creative nonfiction, poetry, and short stories. Comes out once a year. I'm behind this year actually on making sure that one gets out, because then we've been publishing that one as as a literary journal, so you can buy it on Amazon. And if you're a SABR member, of course, you get the ebooks of everything free. I think the people who are afraid to jump in, don't be afraid to jump in, basically. There's there's the fact that you have to get your research right. There's going to be fact checking, there's going to be, review, things like that, because anything that's got the SABR name on it now is sort of taken as authoritative. And that, we've become a gold standard, right? And so it means that we can't let anything go out the door that hasn't been fact checked and, so forth and so on. But then when you have just enthusiastic people whose ethos is, well, let's get it right, especially when stories haven't been told correctly, or,
Well,
I mean,
baseball is full of myths.
baseball's
it's
full of
the
myths,
nature of-
exactly. And it's like sometimes the real story is even more interesting than just the broad shape of it,
that the presentation yesterday on the 1897 Ladies' Day riot, the
Right.
real story, right, was much more interesting than
they wrapped him with their parasols to scold him for. Yes, exactly. And then that became in the mind of the sports writer that they ripped up seats and smashed windows, and when there were not even any windows in the ballpark, that kind of a thing. It's like, yeah. I have I don't know if we have time for it, but I have a list of things you don't know that you don't know. that I am getting ready to sort of publish for researchers.
Okay.
One of the things I'm working on is essentially a handbook for baseball researchers called, we don't know what it's going to be called, but it'll probably be called the SABR Baseball Writer's Guide, something like that. One of the things I prepped was there are things that people think they know and that seem like common sense. And then it turns out that once you start researching baseball, it turns out are not true. Like, for example, the Yankees were not called the Highlanders before they were called the Yankees. Be wary of anything that claims that, but you'll see that statement over and over again, like as if it's from authoritative history, because people repeat it over and over again. Team nicknames before the mid 20th century were just nicknames, and they weren't often generated by the teams. They were generated by sports writers and headline writers who, wanted to have, needed snappy names. And what did the fans call the team? That kind of a thing. The official team names, as you know, are like things like the Boston American Baseball Club. And so they were called the Boston Americans, but I don't see fans in the stands probably being like, hey, how about those Americans? Like, obviously that's not what people said, right? So you ended up with things like the Highlanders, the Hilltoppers, the Yankees, et cetera. All these nicknames were used contemporaneously. And of course, it's easy to disprove. You can go back and find newspaper clippings from 1902 that say Yankees. So, and of course, eventually teams got smart and started officially adopting their nicknames. And now, of course, they are trademarked and, all that kind of thing. But
you can take that same idea and
right.
apply it to something as simple as the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, right? Because that's not always been its title.
Right.
And yet that's what everybody, and people attach that to years when it wasn't that. And
right, exactly. Heck, even Pittsburgh was spelled two different ways in history. And you got to know which era of Pittsburgh's history are you writing about? And so then are you going to use the GH everywhere, or are you going to go back and forth depending on what year you're writing about?
Right.
Got that kind of a thing. This is especially confusing when you get things like the Washington, D.C. American League Club was called the Nationals, which was a terrible idea. Why did they do that? And now, of course, the National League team in Washington, D.C. is also called the Nationals, but they're not connected. So, these are things that you might not know until you start digging into it, right? So
there were football teams with the same name as baseball teams way in the past.
That also, yep.
Things.
So I've got, I don't want to run down the whole list because I don't know if I want to take all of our time. I'd like to get some questions, but things like home run distance doesn't mean what you think it does, even though it's this number that, but home run distance does not mean what you think it does. Pitch speed is not comparable across all eras, things like that, that you should know. Be careful with idioms that are literal. Like we say, we use the term behind the plate to mean umpired. So we say, oh, so-and-so was behind the plate that day. And then you realize that actually in the 19th century, a lot of time the umpire didn't stand behind the plate, they stood behind the pitcher. So you can't use that phrase if you're talking about an umpire who might not have literally been behind the plate, because then you've just basically made a statement that may be inaccurate. So baseball research is full of little pitfalls like that, but we'll train you out of it.
Well, and Jay put the link in so thank you, Jay, to the SABR style guide that currently exists, which is also very helpful just when you're thinking about baseball specifically. And then, but baseball, to Cecilia's point, right, transcends all of these other issues. It doesn't sit in a little vacuum all by itself. And so recognizing that idea. Please, if you have other questions for Cecilia and Kate, please put them in the chat. I'm watching to make sure that we don't miss any. And I'm just going to mention, as we're thinking about this idea, Cecilia and Kate are both talking about these wonderful opportunities, the resources, the ability to create these databases. And I just want to remind everybody that there are literally thousands of women's baseball stories out there that have not been told. Literally, I mean, so you can trip over them. Cecilia just mentioned a couple of names earlier, Judy Scarafil and Ann Ochi, who are unknown to most people. And that those are the tip of the iceberg. And if you're really looking for a place where you might find, if you're saying, well, I wonder, check out minor league baseball, because while Major League Baseball hasn't had many at the higher levels of the front office, minor league baseball certainly has. And there's a plethora of people and names available to tell those stories. So I'm currently working on one, just thought on Elaine Weddington Stewart. So yes, everybody knows Kim Ang's name, but and Jean Afterman, but Elaine Weddington Stewart is in that same, and she was actually the first. And so a name that a lot of people don't. So there's lots of names out there for and stories to be told. And so we just, and if you're not sure and you say, I want to write, ask somebody as well.
I was fascinated how in Jay's presentation yesterday about Lizzie Murphy,
yeah,
it was like almost every article, you know, from some town somewhere where she went and played, then mentioned that the one woman who played baseball in their town. And it's like,
Yep.
well, that woman's story needs to be told. So it's like, when I say you go down a rabbit hole, this is what I mean.
you do.
And then when, if you research that person, then maybe you're going to come up to another one and another one, you know, that kind of a thing. So it's like all of those should be told. I don't know that we've written, I'm sure we have not written biographies of all of the All-American girls even at this point.
Almost none, actually.
You know,
Individual.
so
There aren't even
Yeah.
team books on every one of the teams yet either.
Right.
Just to show, I mean, so that's the league that people know the most about, right?
Right.
Because of the movie
Right.
and things. And yet, and Kate just told you, her collection is available to everyone. There's over 2,000 articles. So what a great start to anybody that
Right.
wants to look at that kind of thing.
Right.
Because if you want to start with something that's fairly easy to get some of the materials and things like that, that's a great place to start. And most of those stories have still not been told. And so you don't even have to dig too much farther to get into those kinds of ideas.
And I don't think that I'm over speaking on, you know, we get to this and we post them everywhere, you know, we can cross post them with SABR and IWBC. So you get published with Cecilia, and then, you know, you come talk about it on our podcast, or, you know, you've got something that you want to essentially donate to our archives to be able to put onto resource pages. I know I started, I think it was towards the end of 2020, I'd come across the list of the Little League ball players, the 19 or 20 of them that have played in the history. And I was just trying to find information on those. So you could essentially have a resource page just dedicated to women's profiles. And then, of course, Leslie shared with us on Friday, one of the Little League players I didn't know. It wasn't on that list. She wasn't on that list. So she ended up sending me an article, and now it's in that list and eventually will be turned into a resource page. So all of this builds on itself. And
Marlene
it
just
helps
gave
us be more visible.
Yeah.
Right.
And Marlene just gave us a great challenge. And she said, time to make a wish list of possible stories and bios. And then she says, I probably have, well, I have my own list, Marlene, but it would be great to have everybody else. And then we could put that list out there. So I'm going to say right now, if you have ideas, a wish list of people that you'd like to learn more about, put them down, send them my direction. We'll create a master list and we'll send it out so that if you're looking for ideas, that's a great idea, Marlene. And we can put it out there so people can say, there's somebody I never knew about. I want to go research that person. And we probably all got wish lists of who those would be. And we could put together a massive one and gradually work it way down. Yes, another collaboration between us.
And it all comes down to being able to find those things too. So, you know, people know who the IWBC are, people know who SABR are, but being able to make those more findable for non-community members are important too. So I'm going to plug this as well. If you go subscribe to our YouTube channel, which I just dropped the main link there, when we hit 100 subscribers, we can customize our link to make us more findable. For everybody. So, you know, I watch women's baseball stuff, so our stuff pops up on my algorithm all the time. But if, you know, somebody went to search the IWBC Archive YouTube channel, not everybody's going to find it because we don't have enough subscribers.
Okay. That's an interesting thing to think. Well, and that raises the other, as you point out, in terms of research, knowing what terms to use, right? As when to look for things and to be able to find what it is that you are looking for. We sometimes think differently than the person who put the collection together, which is where for you, Kate, the archives becomes important, right? And thinking about those kinds of things to make it easier for people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, especially what Cecilia was talking about of essentially being anachronistic. your search terms really fall on that, especially if you're searching newspapers.com. When I was doing my original research, I had a notebook full of search terms because before I started researching, I didn't realize that baseball could be 2 words, in the 18, like it didn't occur to me, of course. Or what do you call women ball players? They're not women. Are they female? Are they girls? Are they the blondes and brunettes? Like that actually turned up more than anything else because that's how people were thinking of them in that time. And then you just have to realize that not everybody's trained to search either. So when I know we have several librarians here, we have an entire class on learning how to search, and in like training students or talking to faculty members or whatnot. That's a big part of it, is teaching them how to search databases.
Right,
So,
absolutely. Because it's the starting spot, and we don't sometimes tend to think about simple things like that. We've got just a few minutes left, so if you've got a burning question that you're still thinking about, please feel free to throw it in the chat as we're talking through some of these resources for with Kate and Cecilia. Just checking. Yes, somebody 100% Googling is not the same as searching a database. Absolutely not. And the other thing to remember, of course, when these players are found, are they put into a structured database with name, location, team, or is everything long form? That's a really interesting question, Elizabeth. And certainly for me, mine has made the transition slowly from long form to the digital world. I'm a historian. I still do things, a lot of it the old fashioned way. And so getting it all put into those kinds of forms, I think is sort of where people like Kate are helping to make sure those kinds of things happen.
Well, and I'll point out, we also don't have as much access to database development as, some organizations do. So our resource pages are very much still long form. But one of the reasons they're created in Google Google Docs is because you can use Control F to search. And we try to make sure that we include all of those things in each of our entries to make it easier. If you're searching, our active list and you want to know what teams we have in Canada, you can hit Control F and search Canada and go through the list that way, which will make it easier when we can't afford to build those databases.
Right. So I see Jay Hurd said he still doesn't cite Wikipedia. Any thoughts on the use of Wikipedia? And I will say that SABR does not accept citations from Wikipedia. And it's basically the case that Wikipedia can be a good starting place for finding the breadcrumbs. Any well-written Wikipedia article is, copiously cited. And then those citations are the places where then you need
and
to
that's
go. And that
and I building on that, it also depends on, I would say definitely for baseball background, yes, starting point Wikipedia. But just depending on what your topic is when you're using Wikipedia articles also depends, because I know that there's been a very concentrated effort in the scientific world to go through with scientists and edit those articles. So if you know of those types of efforts, or are interested in leading an effort like that, it could lead to making those more citable.
Right.
Exactly. And as to follow up with that, I don't allow my students to ever cite Wikipedia. Most of us don't, but we use it for, like any encyclopedia, right? It's a jumping off point. And as Keith pointed out in the chat, it's the footnotes, right? That could be potentially helpful to go see what their sources are and start there. And as Ryan points out, we certainly can contribute to Wikipedia articles to make them better. But it's still that idea that they can be changed by and so they start out as a great resource for everybody. So we're coming up on our hour, and so Cecilia and Kate, any last either bit of advice or something that you wanted to tell everybody that you haven't had a chance to say and you don't want to let this opportunity go before we
I guess I'm going to come back to that theme we keep coming to of building your own runway. And that's if the research interest that you have out there doesn't have a pre-made place where you can publish it and whatnot, you know, these days you can just start a blog, start a podcast, start doing it and putting it out there and make yourself the authority on whatever that thing is. And don't be afraid because you're non-traditional, you know, because you're a woman, because you don't speak English as your first language, whatever it is, you know, just so what? Now we're in that era where you have that ability to just go out and do it. And the reason I ended up SABR Publications Director is literally because I started a blog. I started it so long ago, the word blog didn't exist yet. So, you know, and it's like, and I had literally had to code it by hand in HTML because there weren't like pre-made blog sites yet. And I just had to, I don't know, I was a nerd and I did it. And it led to, you know, me writing a book about the Yankees, and that led to me writing for the Yankees. And then that led to me editing articles and things, and, you know, the Yankees annual, and then the baseball prospectus annual, and, you know, so forth and so on. And then, you know, and eventually I started editing for SABR, and now I'm the editor for SABR. So, you know, it's just, I didn't know that's where it was going to go, but that's where it went. So,
Sure.
you know, yeah, like Kat says, yeah, grab a shovel, start digging your path. If you don't see a path pre-made for you, you know, just start putting it out there, and then people will come to you who are like, oh, I know about that thing, you know. So yeah. You don't have to follow our rules if you don't want.
Kate?
Marlene, you did not miss a discussion on international or non-English resources, but I will tell you that I'm pretty sure all of the resources the IWBC currently has are all English. I would love to talk to people about non-English. I unfortunately do not speak another language. I am going to drop our link tree in here. We keep that updated all the time about our different things going on. The capital campaign sitting in there right now. There's a link to the conference shirts. And then to build off of what Cecilia had been saying, you know, just take those curiosities. Kat's going to shake her head at me. But, you know, 10 years ago, I could not tell you that I was going to be an archivist for an international organization like this one. And it is because of Kat. I'm sport identified, but I had never really looked at baseball, especially women's baseball. Kat can tell you, in the first class I ever took with her, I didn't even realize that A League of Their Own was based on a true story. And now I have, you know, finished 2 history degrees, all focused on women's baseball, and finished my time at the University of Michigan to become this person for the IWBC. And it started even before the IWBC was a thing. I didn't know that that was where I was going. So follow those curiosities, and you'll learn that, you know, you're going to end up where you're supposed to be.
Great advice. And both of you, and so you saw from both their stories that you never know where you're going to end up. And Marlene, you asking about the international sources. It's always an interesting and difficult one, but the part of it, the difficulty is whether you yourself can access the sources in the language. Makes it much easier. So there's certainly a plethora of Spanish sources out there. There are actually a plethora of Japanese sources as well. And with Google, not that it's, and my students would jump on me right now with what I'm going to say, but you can use Google Translate to at least get you started, but that is not what you rely upon. But there are a fair number, and there are more and more of those becoming available. And there are, in some of the newspaper databases, there are specific aspects where you can solely look for resources in other languages and things like that. And so that can be really, really helpful when you look into the databases and say, no, I only want the Spanish resources, or I only want the Japanese, Chinese. And so more and more of that is becoming available to us as well.
Do we have some resources at SABR or IWBC pointers? Do we have any kind of finding aids or pointers at SABR to some
for the international foreign language? Not specifically, but it's pretty easy. It's a pretty easy thing to add to. And so that's a very good suggestion in terms of thinking about that. I see IWBC is working with Archivist to volunteer to translate our material, right? And of course, SABR does has already had a number of their books translated into Spanish. And so so both organizations are doing some of that as well, and thinking about that, because there's a huge aspect of that part of the game for men and women that needs to be looked at. Dominicans in Major League Baseball comes out this year. So that's the newest one. Thanks, Scott. So the idea of translating these into Spanish, certainly, the next place would be to look to translate them into Japanese and some of the other, which is certainly a much harder difficulty. So
but that's also what's so great about our international collaborations.
Yes,
is that we do have people in those areas that are trained and could help.
Right.
If that is something that they're interested in doing.
Yeah.
Let me just say thank you again to all of you researchers and historians, and there's so many people on this call right now who have done such great research, and mostly what I know is through SABR and its volunteer work, and you guys are amazing, and thank you so much. You are very much appreciated, and I don't know how you do it all, but I just want to say a big thanks again.
Well, thank you, Marlene. We appreciate that. And that's a perfect segue into thanking Cecilia and Kate for their participation today, the great information that you have shared with everybody. And I know they'll be happy to hear from you if you have ideas, thoughts, etc. So thank you both. Really appreciate it. And others, if you have thoughts and ideas about some of these things, don't hesitate to shoot us messages. We're always wanting to hear and thinking about ways that we can put together information and resources that are helpful to people. And Kate just put hers in the chat as well.